want to welcome everybody today to UC Berkeley Labor Center's webinar on the public sector impacts of the Great Recession and COVID-19. Today we're going to be looking at both understanding what happened in the Great Recession to public sector jobs and what that meant for the overall economic recovery and how that differed by some of the different types of public sector jobs, as well as looking at some of the data that we now have on what's happening with the public sector as a result of COVID-19 and what that means going forward with different kinds of policy responses from the state. I'm really happy to have presenting today Sarah Hinckley, who is a specialist with the UC Berkeley Labor Center. Prior to that, she was the Associate Director of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at Berkeley, where we're housed, and then had, prior to getting her PhD from UC Berkeley, worked with both SEIU, United Service Workers West, Good Jobs First, and California Labor Federation. Justin McBride, who's now a graduate student researcher out of UCLA. He's a graduate researcher for us, but is studying his PhD in UCLA. And immediately prior to this was with the AFL-CIO as a lead organizer, worked on the Clean Car Wash campaign, and has also worked in the past with SEIU and Unite Here. So a long history of organizing, and had in his role at the AFL-CIO used to work with us on some trainings. So happy to have both of them present, and I'm going to hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you. I think we're all would love to do all these things live, but we thought it would be helpful to walk folks through this report and then try to take some questions in the chat at the end. So feel free to use that to ask for questions that we hope to save 10 minutes or so at the end to talk about. So in this presentation, I'm going to show a lot of the figures from the report that we released, the data brief, which is on our website. Those are numbered in here, and then the rest of these are new figures. This slideshow will also be available online afterward, along with a recording. I should mention this webinar is being recorded, so that will be also posted and available for people afterward. So one of the questions that we've been thinking a lot about as we start to see the employment impacts of the shelter-in-place orders and what has now been officially declared a recession is to what extent we can do better than we did after the Great Recession in terms of recovery. So I'm going to walk through some of what we've been thinking about and talking about. Today we want to look at 4 areas. One is who works in the public sector in California. The second is what happened to public sector jobs in the last recession and what has happened just in the last 3 months. And third is what we think might happen in the next several months to revenues in California, so that we can think about how job loss might continue in the next several months. And then why it's so important to think about the public sector as a key component of long-term economic recovery. So first, who works in the public sector? In California, the majority of public sector workers work in local government, the majority of those in education, so school district employees. Far fewer people work for the state government or in federal jobs cited in California. We have seen, we'll talk a little bit more later about the progression of different parts of the public sector over the last 10 years. But you can see that local education and local non-education employment are by far the biggest segments of California's public sector. So what happens to local revenues is going to be really important for public sector employment over the next several years. That distribution of jobs within California's public employment hasn't shifted a lot over the last several years. It's remained pretty stable. The percentage of public sector workers as a part of the overall economy has been shrinking slightly after rising a little bit earlier in the early part of this century. The public sector also doesn't parallel the demographics of the private sector or the economy overall. Most people watching this probably are aware that the public sector, for several reasons, has been an area of opportunity for workers of color, particularly Black workers, in part because the government does a better job of complying with anti-discrimination hiring practices. Because public sector jobs are higher wage jobs, often with benefits and full-time employment, the overrepresentation, particularly of Black workers in the public sector, is something that we've been thinking a lot about in this recession, particularly given that the impacts in the private sector of job loss and health impacts of the pandemic have fallen particularly hard on Black households and Black communities in California. So Black workers, more than 1/5 of California's Black workers work in the public sector. That's a higher percentage than any other demographic group. If you look, and these are figures from our data brief, if you look at the distribution in local, state, and federal government jobs, you can see that Black workers are particularly overrepresented in federal jobs. If you remove local education from local government jobs, Black workers are significantly overrepresented in non-education local employment. So this all means that in addition to being concerned about public sector job loss in general, we're concerned about the equity implications as public sector jobs become under threat. So what happened in the last recession and in the last 10 years? In the US, we saw significantly stagnant public sector job recovery after the recession. So from 2007 to 2019, you can see that the federal government, this green line, spikes when we do hiring for the 2010 census. Coincidentally, we may see a similar pattern if hiring for the 2020 census spikes again this summer. But in state and local government, you can see that we only regained the pre-recession employment levels really less than a year before we began this pandemic. So these are US figures. In California, we did a little better, particularly in the state government sector. A lot of that was because we recovered our state education sector largely through implementing significant tuition and fee increases at both CSU and the University of California. So you can see that state government employment recovered much better than the US in California, although we still did not regain pre-recession employment levels for several years after the recession began. And this is important because keep in mind that we're only 3 months into the current recession, if this turns out to be a similarly long period of economic decline. If you look at the fact that California's population has grown by about 9%, as has the nation's since the Great Recession, you can see that our state and local sectors have fallen even further behind compared to population growth. And we'll come back to this little dip here at the end when I talk about what's happened in the last 3 months. The share of total employment occupied by state and local workers has not recovered to the level below the Great Recession. So per capita, we have a significantly smaller public sector entering into this pandemic than we did when we entered into the Great Recession. If we look nationally at where these job impacts were the most severe, it was general state employment and local education. This is national trends. These are all from our data brief. If you look at California, our local education sector recovered much better than nationally. Some of that is because in California, school districts were able to pass parcel taxes to make up for some of the revenue loss. Someone see if this works better. And in California, you can, again, we talk in the report about the fact that state education employment recovered much faster than nationally and much faster than non-education state employment. So we break this down in our report to give you a sense of how the recession impacted different segments of the public sector. I want to talk a little bit about what's happened since 2020. So in the US, you've probably heard that employment began to recover slightly in May when numbers came out for the US and for California. Unfortunately, that recovery has been so far confined to the private sector. So in May, we saw continued job losses in the public sector, both nationally and in California. In California, the pace of public sector job loss was faster than the job loss rate in the nation. And the recovery rate for private sector employment was slower than it was in the nation. So these are preliminary figures, but the fact that California's public sector has been losing jobs significantly for these 3 months is obviously cause for concern. And you'll see in this, I showed this figure earlier, but you can see with this blue line on the right that our state and local employment has already dipped below where we were 6 years ago, back in 2014. So in real terms, even though we have many more people in California than we did 6 years ago, in real terms, we are already back at employment levels that we saw 6 years ago, at a time when we were still coming out of a significant period of austerity. The reason that we're concerned about this, particularly now, is that for many local governments, they haven't yet begun the kinds of layoffs and budget cuts that they'll be implementing in the next month as they adopt their 2020-21 budgets. So these are just layoffs that were done because people were not able to perform their work, or because of immediate cash flow loss. It doesn't yet reflect the kinds of revenue loss that we expect to see in the next couple of months. So Justin's going to talk a little bit about what we expect to see and how revenue sources in California are going to be impacted as we go through the next several months. So Justin, you should just tell me when to move to the next slide.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So already the COVID crisis has started to impact the budgets, both at a national level, state level, and local level. You know, estimates are around $500 billion of a shortfall on a national level, and significant shortfalls in California too. Yeah, go ahead to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about how bad it's going to be. And the truth is that nobody knows exactly for sure, but we can talk a little bit about what we do know. This chart shows the typical revenue mix of the tax revenue mix for California over the past kind of 17 years. And as you can see, the most important areas are income tax. Last year is around 70% of the general fund revenues, and then sales tax revenues are also an important revenue stream. As you can imagine, these two streams are going to be affected by the COVID crisis pretty significantly, both because people are out of work and because stores have been closed for a long time, particularly in some parts of the state. Go ahead to the next slide, please. I hope this is better. So this chart shows our general fund tax collections adjusted for $2007, the red line. And you can see that actually, like, California does collect more in taxes now than they did leading up to the recession. The kind of general theory in California is you tax particularly wealthy earners and save the money for rainy days, although perhaps not as rainy as COVID. But you can see that this has risen a lot but this will change, I think, in the coming year. Go ahead to the next slide. And this just shows the relative weights again of the different kind of revenue streams. So what's most important to look at here is how big the shortfalls might be. There's a lot of discrepancy around it. The governor's Department of Finance is projecting a $54.3 billion revenue budget problem, which is essentially a deficit. The Legislative Analyst's Office is saying it's going to be much smaller, between 18 and 30 billion roughly. And the LAO projects that 14 to $20 billion of that shortfall is going to be in the income tax, so the red line here. So you could look and see where that would be $20 billion lower. And that sales tax revenues for the state at least will drop between $4 and $7 billion. That's the rosier estimate. The Department of Finance is saying it could be almost twice as big as that. So how bad it's going to be, we're not really sure. And you can even see some of the difference in projection in some of the talks around the budget that have been going on. Next slide. The local revenue picture is much more complicated. When I'm talking about local governments, I'm talking about cities, counties, and also districts like K through 12 school districts, community colleges, transportation authorities. All of them rely on kind of the same sorts of revenue streams, but the mix is very different depending on the type of jurisdiction and then particularities of how a jurisdiction structures their finances. I'll just go over a few of these quickly. Property taxes, I think most of us are familiar with. These were hit particularly hard in the last recession, and it's not clear what's going to happen with them in this recession yet. So yeah, I think we'll talk more about that later, but it's something to look for. If your city relies on property taxes, so far those have been mostly stable. Transient occupancy taxes are taxes that jurisdictions charge to people who stay in hotels, essentially. And a lot of jurisdictions thought that this was like a free lunch because people who don't live in your city usually pay these. But one of the unique things about this crisis is that people can't travel anymore. So jurisdictions that rely on those a lot are probably going to have issues. Local governments use sales tax, the exact same sales tax as the state. Although they can vary their rate a little bit. They can't charge whatever they want, but there's like a range that they're allowed to charge. And so some cities or counties who are the ones that rely on sales tax typically will have maxed out that kind of range, and other ones have not. As a rule of thumb, in like LA County in Southern California, they tend to be higher. The other one that I'll mention is intergovernmental funds. Some types of governments rely on these heavily, particularly education in counties. And so if you're looking at a jurisdiction that uses a lot of these, you have to pay much more attention to what's going on at the state. Next slide. So you can see some of the effects of the crisis, previous crisis in this chart. Property tax revenues dropped drastically, but it takes time for that to happen, and it took several years and to hit sort of rock bottom of that. And intergovernmental transfers also dropped more as the state's budget crisis got worse and worse over time. All this to say that although it feels like this has been going on forever since we've all been locked in our houses, we're still in very early days of this crisis, and some of the effects may not fully manifest on local budgets for several years. Next slide. So where do you find this information? There's a few sources you could look at. Budget is a jurisdiction's aspirational sort of spending plan for the coming year. And so jurisdictions will be releasing those soon for the coming year. That'll be what they plan on spending monies on, and it's a good place to see relative priorities. CAFR, which I think is Certified Annual Financial Report, is like the postmortem of what they spent on the previous year. CAFRs are good places to see how much money they have in reserves and things like that. Bigger jurisdictions are doing their own projections, much like the State Department of Finance. So if you're like in LA or San Francisco, you can look there and see what they're projecting their revenue mix will look like in the coming year at least, and sometimes beyond. And then the California State Controller maintains 3 databases that you can look at, one for cities, one for counties, and one for districts. And so those are good ways to compare over time how revenue mixes have changed, how expenditure categories have shifted. And if you control in some way, typically for budget size or something else, you can even look between cities to see like, oh, this city takes a lot more in transient occupancy taxes. The auditor did a like much easier to read and less informative sort of look at cities that you could look at. The Census Bureau has some data, but they take that less frequently. Next slide. So what should you be asking? Well, what's the revenue mix look like is the most important. As I said earlier, you know, if they rely a lot on transient occupancy taxes, that's a problem. If it's mostly property taxes, it may not be as bad so far. You have to figure out where the kind of volatility is and what other options might exist. Is the sales tax maxed out, for example? Expenditures, this will tell you how your jurisdiction is planning on changing their spending and sort of where their priorities are. Debt burden is really important because it tends to be a pretty inflexible part of your budget in terms of expenditures. People have to pay their interest to financial markets essentially. And so that will also tell you if they've maxed out what they can borrow. And then reserves are important. Jurisdictions are supposed to have a reserve policy. Much like many of us, I'm sure, some have special dedicated savings funds. And some just like roll over a balance in their account. You can look in the CAFR or other places, and if they have a reserve policy, it'll usually be listed out there. But it's important to see like what are they required to maintain, what have they actually maintained, and what can they spend it on. Next slide. So I think that's it for my part. I'm going to pass it back to Sarah now.
Sorry, I can't figure out how to keep the screen while unmuting. So in the last, I want to go back to one of the earlier slides about what happened to revenues in the last recession. So if you notice in the state government, there's a much greater reliance on sales taxes because the rate that the state sets is much higher. Local governments get a smaller piece of that. So sales taxes are more volatile. They respond more quickly to downturns, as we've seen in the current downturn, particularly because businesses have been closed, but they tend to recover more quickly. It's not clear yet whether this recession will follow a similar pattern, primarily because of the business closures that are still in effect and possibly going to go back into effect in California, depending on public health progression. The state also obviously relies much more on income taxes, in particular income taxes on the top 1%, which also introduces volatility at certain times. But then if you look at local governments, there are two pieces I wanted to highlight. One is, as Justin said, property taxes tend to be more stable even in significant downturns. It's not clear yet whether property taxes will respond as strongly in this recession as they did in the last recession, partly because the last recession was driven by a bursting of the property values on which property taxes are based. If they do, then we'll see greater impacts at the local government level, particularly for schools. I also wanted, though, to highlight this purple line at the top of state intergovernmental aid. So as most of you know, a lot of local governments, in particular counties, rely heavily on state funding for programs that are provided by the local governments. So what happens at the state budget level does significantly impact local governments. And that's the world we're all living in now, waiting to see what happens with the state budget. So in the last recession, California took a couple of different approaches. Like many states, California did do some revenue increase measures. There were sales tax increases, temporary sales tax increases at the state level. Many local governments sought sales tax increases if they weren't already at the local cap. There were state income tax increases, both temporary ones implemented by the legislature, and then Prop 30, which was passed to increase the amount of funding that would particularly go to schools. There were fee increases in all areas of government. Many areas of state and local government are heavily reliant on fees. Our higher education system, particularly after the recession, became even more reliant on fees. And so we saw fee increases implemented throughout the system. Those can provide some stability and insulation for systems like UC from state budget fluctuations, but it also puts a greater burden on the users of those services. For example, students who are going into the UC system. We also saw local governments, some local governments. All right, we'll keep going and hopefully that won't happen again. Always fun to have a new Zoom error pop up. So we did see both state and local governments respond with some efforts to increase revenues in the 4 to 5 years following the recession. We also saw momentum for building higher reserves, particularly at the state level, which has been helpful in our state budget situation right now. But we also saw widespread statewide furloughs, layoffs and spending cuts, and job loss throughout the components of the public sector that we talked about earlier. So we want to talk about why that is of concern as we enter the next few months. One is that the economists widely agree that the recovery throughout the economy after the Great Recession was one of the weakest recoveries on record. It took longer for key indicators to rebound, indicators like the official unemployment rate, the employment to population ratio, the reduction of long-term unemployment. All of those indicators took many more years to recover than they had in previous downturns. And some of the measures of the health of the economy have never recovered or have gotten significantly worse. So underemployment, the precarity of jobs that people hold, rising instability in people's ability to get full-time work, to get stable scheduling, stagnant wages, many of the things the Labor Center has been publishing reports about for the last 10 years, make clear that the recovery after the Great Recession was both weak and significantly uneven. That inequality was able to widen significantly over the last several years for many reasons, but it demonstrates that we don't want to repeat the kind of recovery that we saw after the Great Recession. It's also notable that the public sector recovery was weaker after this recession than it has been in other recessions. So one of the comparisons we make in our data brief is that the public sector was not nearly as impacted after the 2000-2001 recession as it was after 2007. We didn't see the same levels of austerity, we didn't see the same levels of revenue loss, and that was important in moving us toward an economic expansion after that time. So we missed that public sector recovery over the last 10 years. And we know that public sector employment, as we showed you earlier, lagged well behind population growth. And that's not just an indicator of missing public sector jobs, which we care about because people, we need those jobs and that income to help keep the economy strong. But it also means that our public services are not as robust as they were before the last recession, which is obviously particularly troubling as we enter into or are already in the middle of a pandemic that requires a robust public infrastructure in response. So when we think about the need for public healthcare workers, for better monitoring of things like nursing home quality or public health, the ability to take public health measures like contact tracing and testing, all of those are more difficult to do if you just simply have a more anemic public sector than we did 10, 12 years ago. The public sector also, as an employment sector, matters to the economy because of the kinds of jobs that it offers. The public sector has high employment and income multipliers compared to other sectors of the economy. And that means, I think my slide is, here we go. That means that public sector workers, because those jobs are stable jobs that provide opportunities for advancement, that provide full-time employment and usually benefits, in addition to solid middle-class wages, the economy is hurt when those jobs disappear. So some of the analysis the Labor Center did after the last recession used a program called IMPLAN to estimate the jobs and income that were lost throughout the economy when the state took actions like major layoffs or furloughs that reduced the income of public sector workers significantly. So we ran some of these numbers again just to show you why these jobs matter so much to economic recovery and why reducing those jobs doesn't save the government as much money as it might look like on paper. So for 100,000 jobs lost in state and local employment in California, and we distributed those jobs among healthcare, education, and other sectors in correspondence to the way job loss happened after the last recession. For every 100,000 jobs, another 50,000 plus jobs are lost in the economy. And these are jobs that are lost just because you have 100,000 people with less income and ability to put that income into use in the economy. So the multiplier for state and local jobs in California is 1.5, which means that for every job you lose another half of a job in the economy somewhere. And you also lose federal tax revenue and state and local tax revenue. So as the state layoffs and budget cuts become more clear in the next few months, and as local employment loss becomes more clear, these are the kinds of trends that we're going to be continuing to model so that we can understand the likely impact on the economy. And many of the job losses that are sparked by the cuts in the public sector are in the same segments of the economy where we've already seen significant employment loss. One of the characteristics of this recession is that everything has happened in a much more compressed time frame than the last recession. So households have lost a significant percentage of their income, not over a period of several years, but over a span of a few months. And that has a ripple effect that we need the public sector to be able to stave off rather than feed into. And that means that we need to see the state and local governments use other strategies for managing these shortfalls rather than simply laying people off or implementing significant income reductions. So there was one other piece of information that we've been tracking is in comparison to how this unfolded in the Great Recession, we're seeing public sector layoffs happen as public services are not able to be provided given public health restrictions. So for example, school districts throughout the state had to close down for the last 3 months of this year, which meant that employees such as custodians and other workers that are necessary for keeping schools open couldn't go to work. So one of the things that needs to be explored as a difference in the last recession is the employment impacts of economic activities not being permitted with public health guidelines compared to the kinds of distribution of layoffs that happened in the last recession because of underlying economic factors as the economy slowed down. And I think we're still at a stage in this recession where we don't yet understand what kind of recession we're in. So we've spent a lot of time trying to track different estimates of what the recovery might look like. Is it going to rebound in September with the economy looking exactly the way that it did in January, or is something different going to take shape? And I think nobody knows that scenario yet. And the uncertainty of the public health crisis that's unfolding, even in the last week, as California has seen new outbreaks in the pandemic, makes that even harder to predict. But it seems clear that we need the public sector, particularly given that level of uncertainty, to provide some type of additional stability, even more than we would in a normal downturn, precisely because we need a robust set of services in order to ensure that other segments of the economy are able to come back to life. And I think we saw that reflected in the state budget deal that is still emerging around, for example, ensuring that our public schools can open with something closer to adequate funding than the governor originally proposed. So those are the conversations that I think are important to keep having about how we keep the public sector funded in such a way that we can facilitate the reopening of other parts of the economy, in addition to the normal stimulus that the public sector provides to economic recovery in a sort of standard recession. So those are the things that we've been exploring. We've published a data brief. We have a blog post upcoming about the lessons from the last recession, and we're happy to take questions and let you know, see if questions we can either answer now or talk about as future paths for research in the Labor Center. And our Zoom call didn't get kicked off again. So. Unfortunately, I lost the questions from the last chat that were already in there. So if you asked questions in the previous iteration of this meeting, ask them again, because we don't have that chat. Oh, common questions asked.
Somebody asked about in-home supportive services. And just a note there, yes, we have seen in the last recession, we saw cuts in IHSS, and that those the state-funded home care program. And we did look at the different kinds. Sarah talked about multipliers. We looked at different kinds of multipliers from different programs. And because the IHSS draws down so many federal dollars, each dollar spent in the state, you get additional dollar for the federal government. The multiplier on IHSS in terms of job creation is very high. And it makes it very clear cutting services, especially services that draw down federal dollars during a recession, has a big negative impact on growth, because all of those programs have big multipliers. And I think all of this pushes to the need to be looking at. The other thing we looked at in that earlier research is how each of those programs compared to the effects of raising taxes, especially either taxes on the wealthy or some other specific taxes. And the jobs impacts of raising taxes are minuscule compared to the job impacts of an austerity economy, job impacts of cutting public services and cutting public employment. And I think that becomes really, when we look at the sort of the trade-off here of what we can do, that the effects of going towards austerity and cutting the public sector has a much bigger negative impact on the economy than we could get from raising taxes, or the other way to put it around, raising taxes would be a big boost to, especially on the wealthy, would be a big boost to the economy. And just note that that's where we see the big consumption going down right now. So what we're seeing thus far is, because of the higher level of unemployment insurance going to low and middle wage workers, which will run out at the end of this month, consumption has not fallen from low and middle income households. It's fallen from the wealthy or people at the higher end. And because they're not spending money. You can't travel, you can't do some of the other luxury things that people would do. And that's precisely why looking at some taxes in that area right now to put money into desperately needed services could serve to get the economy back much quicker.
Yeah, I think too, we've seen a resurgence of conversation around public jobs programs and the ability of government to use its power as an employer of last resort or to participate in actual job creation. And I think one of the reasons for that is that one of the impacts of this shelter-in-place order has been that people are kicked off of jobs, and we're concerned about people having long-term detachment from the labor market, which research from the last recession showed is damaging for people's entire careers. And so using the government and the public health needs that we have to think creatively about how we create ways to attach people to the labor market to avoid that long-term gap in employment is really important. And then similar to what Ken was saying about IHSS, governments also spend a lot of money on programs that don't end up showing up in the public sector jobs data. So for example, a lot of the infrastructure in California for workforce development is contracted out to places like Goodwill and other providers who effectively run those programs. So the loss of the job loss associated with public spending cuts is even more significant than the losses that we capture in the public sector job loss. And in addition to spending that leads to service provision provided by contractors, you also saw after the last recession a huge drop in capital spending by local governments and the state. Which creates both a backlog of decaying infrastructure, which is not good for the economy either. But that also creates huge impacts and job loss in construction, engineers, inspectors, and other jobs at suppliers for materials required for construction. So the impacts of austerity aren't limited to the loss of public sector jobs. It ripples throughout the job market. When you lose that activity of infrastructure, you lose a whole bunch of other economic activity. Anyone who's been in the Bay Area and seen the proliferation of infrastructure, all of those people are also going out to buy lunch in the cities, they're buying supplies, they're paying gas taxes to get to and from work. So when we think about the cutbacks that happen during a recession, it's not just about the public sector job loss, even though that's what we've modeled here. And as the state budget becomes more clear, we'll have a better way to think about how to model those effects coming into the upcoming budget year or two. I try to look at some more of these questions. So somebody asked about why there's such a difference between the two estimates of the outlook for the state budget. Part of it is that the state revenues, partly because we delayed the income tax deadline for the state, delayed some of the sales tax collection. There are also, and people have raised this in local governments too, there are always some gray area about how much you can draw on reserves for different programs, how much you can borrow reserves and how much you can borrow against reserves and how much you can use techniques like pushing different expenses off to other fiscal years, which is part of the debate that's happened at the state budget level. I think that when we get to August, we'll have some more certainty about what has actually happened to sales and income taxes, which matter most at the state level. So there may be some coming together of those different perspectives. I think also in the last recession, we had a governor who was a very conservative budgeter. So he took a lot of steps. Somebody asked also about what RDAs are. So Jerry Brown's approach was to try to force cities to close some of the tax spending that he thought had put a tax burden on the state, including eliminating redevelopment agencies, which had been enabling local governments to take tax revenue for future projects, but which forced the state to backfill that local tax revenue. So I think Governor Brown used the state's budget shortfall to try to push some of that down to local governments. And we haven't seen that happen in the current debate about state budgets, but that was some of the difference lies in how different governors approach balancing the budget. Governor Brown took steps to balance the budget and then build up a reserve that was seen as a very conservative approach over the last several years, and now has at least put us in a position to have significant reserves as we face this recession.
Just to note, there were a number of questions on schools and communities first, which is the ballot initiative that would reassess commercial properties. And that would help fill significant funding both for schools and for local governments. Now that doesn't come in immediately, and Sarah, you can see more on the timeline on that. So, well, it would, in the long run, have a very big impact on supporting the education system and supporting local governments, which is especially important given all the things we're talking about today. Some other measures are going to will be needed in the meantime as well, in the time between before that revenue is collected.
Yeah, I mean, the slide that we showed about the relative stability of property tax revenue illustrates part of the problem that California faces, which is that property taxes are a stable form of revenue. They're more counter-cyclical than something like sales taxes. And yet in California, we have severely constrained our property tax base through Prop 13. So someone asked about, what are the options for local governments? In California, we don't have the option for local governments outside of parcel taxes to really raise property taxes. Schools and Communities First would at least bring much more of that taxable base into the state system, which would help schools and local governments. But there aren't many other options for local governments to use their property tax base to increase their revenues. There are options for local governments to explore other ways to tax sales, gross receipts. Cities in California have experimented with payroll taxes, different ways of particularly shifting the burden back from residents back to businesses, which is part of the impetus behind Schools and Communities First, is that over time, while we have adopted a lot of measures that move some of the household income burden up toward the top of the income spectrum, we have not done a good job of reallocating the tax burden back to where it was 20, 30, 40 years ago among households and commercial businesses. So the California Budget and Policy Center has been repeatedly conducting research on California's corporate tax system and the fact that we haven't better aligned our system with some of the tax cuts that corporations experienced at the federal level. So our business tax base is not as well drawn from as some other states. Schools and Communities First would help with some of that, and it would also help reallocate some of the burden away from smaller businesses back to larger businesses with larger wealth holdings in the form of property. There's more questions.
A couple of questions about figure 9.
Yeah, so one of the things that we tried to look at within the public sector, there are limits on how much the government, Bureau of Labor Statistics data sources can really tell us about what's really happening in specific sectors. And we wanted to look in more detail at California's K-12 employment. So the California Department of Education collects this data. Unfortunately, they shifted methodologies for how they track classified employment, kind of right smack in the middle of the recovery period. So the solid red line is the way they used to track classified staff before 2014, and then they shifted to an FTE method. So that's why you see the numbers drop significantly, because it used to be a head count, and then they shifted to an FTE method of calculating employment. We have in California seen a significant growth in classified FTEs over this period, partly because of growing services provided for special education and growing special education funding. You can also see that teacher employment dipped significantly. These are classroom certificated teachers, dipped significantly during the recession. Even though it has almost recovered, we're still at a lower teacher-student ratio than we used to be. So we have fewer teachers per student in California than we did before the recession. So hopefully that's more clear. So there are a lot of conversations at many different levels about what are the revenue options and best tax strategies for responding to a downturn like this. The Labor Center's specialty is, what happens to workers in these dynamics. So I think Ken may be able to say more about different conversations that are happening about what a stronger fiscal policy response might look like. But I think the general principles that we've been sharing are that severe austerity doesn't help the economy, that cuts to public services and public spending often produce more downsides than the savings that they might appear to present on paper. And that over the last decade, we've seen such a significant broadening of inequality that we can't afford to miss this opportunity to think about how to restructure our fiscal responses to downturns in order to avoid that becoming even worse in the next several months. I don't know, Ken, if you want to respond.
Yeah, sure. I'll just say that,
questions.
I think in terms of the state, well, 3 things. One is obviously the push right now and the importance of the federal government coming through with another stimulus package that includes funding for state and local government is essential. 2, there are a number of groups out there right now, including the Commit to Equity Coalition and others, looking at increasing revenue in the state in order to avoid austerity. And so some of the kinds of things that people are proposing are a tax on unrealized capital gains, which we could have another conversation on future, but it's a way to get on the very wealthy to effectively prepay their capital gains tax. Second is people are looking at taxes on raising the top tax brackets. There are some other corporate taxes that in terms of closing corporate tax loopholes, all things that sort of would look at targeting taxes towards those who have done really well during this recession and benefited from the Trump tax cuts in order to both support strong public services and to keep the economy running in the future. So there are a number of groups out there having those discussions, and those are really essential conversations to be having right now. So we are at time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Sorry for the little technical glitch in the middle. And we look forward to some continuing conversations in the future.
Thanks.